And today I have the pleasure of introducing David Robson, who is an award-winning science writer, specialized in the extremes of the human brain, body, and behavior. He's written 3 excellent books, The Laws of Connection, The Expectation Effect, and The Intelligence Trap. And his writing has received awards from the Association of British Science Writers and the UK Medical Journalists Association. He's a very prolific writer who's been featured and written in publications all over the UK, the US, most of the big ones you've published in, really, at this point.
Yeah, so far.
Yeah, so far. He was a senior feature editor at New Scientist for 5 years, has been a senior journalist at BBC Future for 5 years, writing a lot about psychology, psychological research, writing some really interesting stuff. So he's got some great examples of work that's been out there and talking about psychological research. I'm really pleased you've agreed to share your experience and expertise today, because I think it's really valuable for psychologists to understand how everything works in kind of the wider world of science communication and media, and just talking about the work you're doing and learning about it with kind of wider world, because there's a lot of different channels and complexity and different media outlets and social media, and how do you figure out all of that information ecosystem. So it's something that's really useful for psychologists to know about. So we're going to structure this, it's about 2 hours, we're going to structure it in about 3 sections. So David's going to talk first for about a third of it. We've got some questions that have been submitted ahead of time, so we're going to do kind of a discussion for the second third, and open it up to question and answers in the third. But we've got a nice small group, so if you have questions, I think feel free to ask questions during the session.
Yeah, definitely feel free to interrupt me. Yeah, if you have anything pertinent to the slide that's up.
Yeah, so we're interested to see what questions you have or what you want to, what you're interested in learning about as well. So feel free to open that up. And we are filming today, so if anyone really doesn't want their questions included, let me know after, or if anyone has any issues with that, we'll make sure we cut everyone out. But we just want to make sure this is shared more widely with everyone who isn't in London, can't attend. So it's going to be freely available after this session, and we'll send the video to everyone who's here today if you had so much fun you want to watch it again over and over. So yes, I think we'll get started.
I guess just while we're getting seated, I can start by just saying a bit more about kind of my background. So I've been working as a science journalist now for 18 years, so I started in about this time in 2006, actually, this time of year. And like Ian said, I worked at New Scientist and then the BBC, so there are my books, and these are some recent articles that I've written just this year. So for the Wall Street Journal, Guardian, that New Scientist cover story. And so I guess each outlet or each medium is going to have its own requirements, but I guess in this part of the kind of presentation part of this afternoon, I'd really like to talk about what I think are some common rules about how to communicate effectively. So just some tricks that I think do work for any medium, and it doesn't matter if it's short form or long form. I think you can incorporate some of these elements into your storytelling, into your messaging, to make sure that it has higher engagement from readers, that it's more memorable, and that it reaches as wide an audience as possible. So I just thought I would point out just how many different channels that there are available to us now. So these are just some of the different outlets that you could write for if writing is your thing. And there's also the radio, obviously, with All in the Mind. You have magazines like GQ are very interested in psychology. You've got specialist publications like The Psychologist, which I love. You've got these publications like Psyche and Eon, which kind of do offer quite highbrow articles on psychology. And then you've got The Conversation, which is specifically designed for academics to share their research. I think their tagline is something like academic rigor with journalistic flair. So the idea there is that you can the editors are kind of on your side, wanting to communicate effectively, but they really do want you to reach as big an audience as possible. And in that case, all of the articles are Creative Commons, so they can also be syndicated to daily newspapers, different websites. So it can be a really good way of spreading your message far and wide. Then we have a lot of new opportunities. Obviously, podcasting is booming, and even though it's audio, I would argue that the kind of elements of storytelling to increase engagement are really important, just as important in an audio medium as it would be in text, in written text. You've got videos on TikTok, I think that, or YouTube, I think the same applies there. Like, the way that you present really has an impact on how your message is perceived. This is Dr. Julie Smith. She had, I think, the best-selling book in the UK for 2022. It was, I can't remember what it's called, like Things I Wish, What I Wish I'd, what's it called? Like, Why Don't People Talk About That? It's a brilliant book, but I think she reached that audience through her 5 million followers on TikTok. So, it's a really effective way. We think of TikTok as being quite superficial content, but actually it's a really good way of communicating responsibly about psychology as well. And then you have newsletters are really booming now, so platforms like Substack, where you don't have an editor to kind of rein in your wilder excesses, but it does give you the freedom to really write about what you want. So we have just so many different ways that we can reach an audience these days, some of which have the entry points might be different, but ultimately you want to make sure that when you are creating that content, you're doing so to the highest possible standard. Now, whatever content we're producing, I think we have to answer all of these questions, which is essentially, first of all, you should make sure that you can summarize your message in a single sentence and say, what you want to tell someone, and you should decide that before you start writing or presenting. So it's really important to have that clear within your head, and obviously it's not going to capture all of the nuances, but you have to have a message in mind to give your content direction. You have to consider who the audience is for, and that's going to dictate all kinds of things about the way that you write. So the level of information that you want to give, what particular techniques you use to create engagement, how much context you have to provide before you present what's new and interesting. Along similar lines, you have to know what is relevant for this particular audience. And if you can't answer that, you probably have to go back to your kind of tagline to think again about what message you want to convey. And then finally, I think any content you have to be aware of why you want to communicate that particular message now. And it's not like it has to be newsworthy, but I think you have to at least think about whether it is because you consider this idea to be part of the zeitgeist, or whether you think it's just evergreen, and that people aren't familiar with something that they should know. But I think to create the best story that you want to tell, you have to bear that in mind, and you have to get that information very early on within the story so that you can capture the audience's attention before they kind of move on. Because one of the disadvantages of all of those outlets that are now available is that people's attention can also be more divided than ever. So you have to make sure that you let them know, why they should be reading you rather than the thousands of other articles that are available. I kind of often think, when I'm thinking about pitching an idea to newspapers or magazines, I think about the dinner party test, and it's just essentially would you want to talk about this over dinner with people that you know but who might not be within your specialism? And again, it's while you're thinking through that, you'll be answering a series of questions like, what is the gap in someone's knowledge that you want to fill? How can this article change someone's life in some way? And that could just be understanding themselves better. It could be giving them practical advice that they'll find useful, or helping them to understand world events in a different way. But they are investing time in reading what you're writing, so there has to be some payoff. And finally, yeah, like if you were having a conversation about this, or your audience were having a conversation about this over dinner, like what's the first thing that you would say to them? And I think that's often the best way to kind of kickstart your writing, is just to know like what the number one piece of information is that you would want to convey. Now I kind of divide content into three broad categories. I think that's relevant when you're talking about psychology or any kind of science. So the first would be explainers. And so that's just that you're introducing a new concept, you're maybe providing context for something that's in the news, or you're offering advice. And so these are a few different examples. So the one on the left, I wrote that for BBC Culture when Inside Out 2 came out, and they wanted to understand like why it was so appealing to different people. And you know, there's a lot of psychology obviously in that film, but the thing that I picked out was that it kind of tells us how to make friends with our anxiety. And so that was really, you know, it was providing a bit of context to a cultural phenomenon, but I think it was also introducing a new concept to people that they might not have, the general public might not have understood, about the importance of stress reappraisals and how that can influence the effects of stress, and just the very fact that emotions like anxiety can have some benefit. We've also got the A Psychologist's Guide to Healing from Racial Trauma, so that appeared in Vogue, and I'll come to that article later on because I think it was very well written. But that, I think, came out during the protests in 2020. Again, it was providing context and feeding into this broader conversation that people were having. And then there's a kind of Halloween, I mean, every Halloween you're going to have an article like that. But, you know, that is more for entertainment, I guess. It's not, and that is a valid, you know, reason to write a piece. If you're causing someone to think about something a little differently, like horror films, you know, that is changing their life in some way, even if it's quite light-hearted. So those are explainers. Next, you have arguments. So, you know, opinion pieces, essentially, where you're trying to persuade or convince using psychological research. And with that, you're leading your audience to a very specific conclusion. So I think that kind of speaks for itself. I think it's, in some ways, it's probably the writing that is most familiar to all of us, that we, you know, and it's also just the way that we communicate with the people around us. Often it's trying to persuade them of our points of views. But the one that I really want to focus on today is narratives, because, well, I'll come to the reason why later on. First, just the definition, you know, like science can tell a really good story. I think it's actually a natural way to talk about science is to talk through a narrative, because the process of discovery has its own narrative arc. It's a kind of, you know, it's following the kind of age-old storyline of, you know, a quest, and, you know, the heroes in that are the kind of people who are trying to discover the truth about something. But it's it really, I think, with science communication, it just is a very natural fit. Now, you know, the elements that you can include are characters, you know, which is often the scientists themselves, or often like patients or clients. Plot, you have scene setting, you have a kind of overarching theme, you include elements of dialogue. Now, you might ask why use narratives, apart from because of this natural fit, because often it might seem that, you know, you just want to talk about a topic rather than to tell a story, like you want to communicate information. And sometimes I think narrative non-fiction can go too far into, there's a lot of fluff where the writer is explaining, you know, like it can read like a kind of diary where the writer will be talking all about their kind of journey to this laboratory, and then they'll be talking about, you know, the appearance of the scientist, none of which is necessarily that relevant to the message that you're trying to convey. But when it's done well, it offers numerous advantages. It's just a natural way to organise your information. So I think we'll talk about this a bit later, but some of the questions that people were asking was, how can you connect the different elements of what you want to say together into something that feels coherent and bigger than the sum of its parts? And a narrative just provides a really slick way of doing that often. Narratives are just more engaging. So I think that's, I think that has been shown with psychological experiments, but I think it's just a conclusion that all kinds of media organisations have come to, and it's why it's so common, is the fact that people's attention is much greater when you're using these elements of storytelling compared to if you're just presenting the factual content with no elements of character, plot, scene setting. They're more memorable. I think we all know that a really good mnemonic technique is to tell a story, even to remember just random sequences of information. Well, it's the same with when you're communicating science. It's actually just much easier for the audience to remember what you're telling them. And if you've got a message that you want to communicate, you want it to be memorable. And finally, it just has the greatest potential to reach the widest audiences. So, when I was in house, you just see this again and again, that the stories that have a good narrative are more likely to be shared by other people. They're more likely to be, to kind of inspire other articles in other outlets, or to inspire content on social media. So it's very much like it's appealing to this kind of instinct that we have, that we all love a good story, and we want to tell, once we've heard a good story, we want to tell it to other people. So it's when I first started at New Scientist, my editor told me, he just said, you need to write in a narrative style. But he didn't actually tell me how to do that. And it wasn't obvious to me actually how you can incorporate these elements into a piece quite effortlessly. So here's just one piece that I wrote. It came out last weekend, and I don't even especially think it's like one of my best pieces, but I just think it's the one that's freshest in my mind, and it helps to illustrate some of these components quite nicely, I think. So it's about karma mutta, which is that experience of having positive tears. So when you might cry at a happy ending in a film, rather than, it's often when the main character is in danger that you cry, but it's actually when they've been saved by their friends. So I'll talk about introductions later, but when you're writing a narrative, you don't have to always begin right at the beginning of the story in the same way that films can, start quite late on. It's fine for you to begin with one scene and then have a flashback to the start of it all. But we don't need to read all of that introduction, but essentially I've presented right at the top this character, Alan Fisk. So he's the protagonist of the piece. I've then just given the background for what the broad story is going to cover, and then we have the kind of inciting incident. And so that is just explaining what inspired Fisk to start investigating karma mutta. And it's a really obvious question to ask when we're talking about research, is where did it come from? So there's just a tiny bit of scene setting here to say that he was on holiday in Norway. He was talking to these other two characters, his kind of sidekicks, who, and they were having this conversation about why they cried at children's films. So that sets you up for what has started the narrative. It's, and then, what I wanted to show with this slide really is how once you've identified that narrative thread that's going to go through the piece, it's quite easy then to connect the different paragraphs together and to build the story up from these smaller pieces. So it's a natural way for you, first of all, to talk about how you come to define this term, what their first steps were in exploring then the psychological construct and developing that. And then you kind of have, I guess, a turning point in the story. It's like a kind of when all of that hard work has come together and produced something that has helped to develop our understanding of that particular concept. You can start bringing in other characters into the story at a certain point. So that's when you broaden it out from just beyond your kind of protagonist, but the people who might have been inspired by them or even who might be disagreeing with them. And then, you get to the end of the story and you can see how hopefully you've had this satisfying arc where like this guy, Alan Fisk, the protagonist, has helped to he's come to the end of his quest in some way, he's reached a satisfying conclusion, and then you just have this kind of ending to kind of wrap it up. And the fact that you've presented him as a character, that means that you can, end on a positive note about the effect it's had on his life in some way. So here he's just saying about how, having discovered this time, it's actually helped him to savour this emotion in everyday life. He's become this connoisseur. He, when you feel it, you realise that you're a loving person and that other people love you. So it's just a kind of more memorable note to end on and say what might be tempting, and I've definitely done it in the past, to be like, the true implications of Kama Mutta might yet to be discovered, more research is needed. It's just a much nicer way of wrapping up the story, and hopefully something that will then leave the reader feeling good about what they've just learnt and wanting to share it. And that's something that we know, especially online, is that the ending is very important for how likely people are to share the piece with other people. It's much more important than the intervening paragraphs. So you have to kind of try to go out on a note that's going to get people, inspire them to be talking about what you've just written. Now you can go a bit more deep into kind of what we mean by plot in these kinds of stories, and writers often talk about Freytag's pyramid. So this was created by the novelist Gustav Freytag, but it's now used a lot in journalism and science writing in general. And so what we see is you have that inciting incident, so the thing that's kind of set the chain of events in motion. You have rising action, so that's the development and progress of the story. You have some kind of climax, and that could just be like the publication of a paper, the discovery that people were looking for, and then you kind of have falling action. So that's, I guess, I don't really like it being called falling action, because I think it's more about exploring the consequences of what's gone on before and kind of broadening out the story to look at the bigger picture. And then you have a resolution, which hopefully is going to take you to a different place from where you started, and that's what I think we saw in that previous story, was that that character, Alan Fisk, he had been through this journey and he had then gained something personally from what he had learnt. So, that is the inciting incident. This conversation, had the narrative elements of scene and dialogue. This, I guess I see as the kind of climax in a way. It was when they did this huge survey that helped them to finally define the construct, and that then helped to inspire all of the later research. And then here you have that kind of falling action where you've got other researchers who are suddenly starting to look at the implications of Kama Mutta for politics, for psychological therapy, followed by this kind of soft ending where you go back to the main character and look at how it's changed his life. Yes?
You said you don't particularly like falling action, which I can understand.
I don't like the term, I guess.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Is it more developing understanding?
Yeah, I think it is that really, and I think it's like if you look at a story, you know, you have if you look at like a film, for example, you would have the climax, and then you're kind of following the consequences, and you're wrapping up in some way. So I think in the scientific context, you're right. It is developing the understanding or broadening the understanding and helping to show what the consequences are of all that you've just told before.
You've got the problem, exposition, you've got a problem, and that's, you know, whatever's going on. You reach the climax of it,
Yeah.
you understand it, and then you...
Exactly. So it's almost like drawing the insights from that solution to that problem. Yeah, it's showing that the consequences of this, it wasn't linear, just going from a problem to solution, but that actually it has knock-on effects that you would find in any story, essentially. So yeah. And here's another example that was written a few years ago, but it's by one of my favourite writers, Virginia Hughes, and so. This was more newsy. It was actually based on just a couple of very recent papers that have been published in a single week. But and it's quite unusual for kind of those kind of quick turnaround news pieces to have a narrative structure, but she did a really good job here, I think, of just questioning the researchers about why they had chosen to do this research that was suddenly in the news. And what she found was that this character, Valerie Selimpour, it was inspired by just hearing one piece of music while she was driving home one day. She was having this kind of quarter-life crisis. She didn't know where she was going to go with her research career. And then Brahms' Hungarian Dance No. 5 came on, and she, I don't think she had to pull over the car, but her emotions were very strong. And from that point on, she realised that what she really wanted to do with her life was to devote it to understanding how music could have this effect. So you can see that Virginia she's giving you some kind of context to that, but she's very quickly coming back to looking at, you know, what the effect of this was on Selimpour, and setting the scene then for the new research that she's going to present. And I just think that is so much more engaging than the news story might have been written by someone else, where it could have begun, you know, like new scientists have discovered that the reward system is important in feeling musical chills. You know, she was telling a story. There was very clear scene setting there, and I think more importantly was that we can identify with that protagonist there, because we've probably all felt moved by music in some way. We might not have had such a strong reaction that it changed the shape of our lives and our research, but it was powerful, I think, because it was relatable. Now, I wish that when I was writing that every single story has such lovely easy kind of narrative arcs to pull out, where you always had a very clear inciting incident. You know, someone had this kind of amazingly transformative epiphany or personal experience or huge challenge in their life that they were going to overcome, and you know, you could write about that using all of that scene setting that I've described that we saw in Virginia's piece. But you know, it's not going to happen sometimes. Like, you know, I think we all know in our own lives that you can, when you move into a particular area of research, you know, there might be lots of small factors at play, but it doesn't always fit like a very neat narrative. So sometimes it's not possible to have like a single protagonist or to incorporate those dramatic scenes within a piece, but I think we can still use the general principles behind narrative to shape the way we talk about science in general. And that is just identifying, I guess, the sequence of events and trying to follow that pyramid structure, where you're still looking for the inciting incident might be just a kind of question that needs to be answered. The climax might be the solution, and then, as we discussed, the kind of falling action might be the consequences of that. But you're looking at those turning points in that story. So, you know, what has been the progression of our thinking. In any research, there has to be some kind of challenge that you have to overcome. Like, it's not easy to prove that your construct is real, for example. So the scientists have had to look at that challenge, or you have personally, and then you can just describe it in those terms. It's of a kind of challenge that had to be overcome, some kind of obstacle. And you're just asking, the challenges, the successes, you're just trying to look at the knowledge that's out there, but ask, like, what was the journey that led us to this point? And what's the kind of principle that I think is so important when we're writing that or presenting it is trying to always ask yourself, what are the contrasts? So at each step of the way, with each paragraph, you want to have a contrast with what had gone before. So it might be an obstacle that means that you were thwarted in one plan, and then the next paragraph after you've presented that obstacle will be how it was overcome. It could be that you're overturning dogma, so one paragraph will describe the dogma, another will then describe the new way of thinking, but you're always trying to build tension by describing these contrasts. And when we do this, and it's true even of those very strongly narrative features, is that we have to signpost what we're doing to the readers. Like, you have to let them know where you're going with the story that you're telling. Otherwise, they begin to feel it's like you're lost in the middle of the countryside, and if you don't know where you're going, it's so frustrating. You're probably just going to try to get out of there. So in journalism, stories have those kind of introductions or leads that I spoke about, and sometimes that might be the inciting incident. Sometimes it might be that event kind of later on in the narrative. It could be it could just be you asking a question or appealing to the reader's own experiences. But you want something that just grabs their attention and leaves enough of a gap in their knowledge that they want to know more. Then you want to have this billboard or nut graph, and it's so essential for any piece, even short or long, but especially for long pieces. The nut graph has to let the reader know what the payoff is going to be. So when you came up with that kind of mission statement for the message that you want to convey, the nut graph has to play to that and to explain to people, why they should care about what you're going to tell them. So hopefully, if you've done that kind of work previously, looking at the, answering those questions about and interrogating yourself for why you want to tell this particular message at this time, that should come quite easily. And if it doesn't while you're writing, then I think that's maybe a sign that you have to go back to the drawing board a bit and really rethink what your whole purpose is for what you're trying to create. And then you have the backstory, and so that's just setting the context for what follows, and I think that is really important for creating that contrast that I mentioned, that's so important. If something has been known forever and is already widely known, and so you can't present something that is new or interesting to the reader, then that's much less likely to capture their attention. Even if you're talking about something historical, you want to at least show that you're giving them some kind of reinterpretation of what had gone before. And then, so once you've done that, then that's when you'll start signalling the development and the turning points in the story that I mentioned. So that's when you'll be trying to look for, what is new, what were the challenges, how did they overcome those obstacles, what was the big success, what are the consequences of this, what are the open questions. So again, I don't think this is a piece that I wrote for New Scientist that came out a few weeks ago. Again, I don't think I'm not saying it's the best version of journalism that you can see, but it's just very fresh in my mind, and I think it illustrates some of these points. So the piece is about this tiny blue dot called the locus ceruleus that's in your brainstem that had been kind of ignored for quite a long time by neuroscientists, or when it had been studied, it had remained kind of quite a niche topic, and now the kind of contrast to what had gone before is the fact that is getting a lot more attention and seems to be playing a much wider role in the way brain activity is orchestrated, with immediate consequences for behaviours that will be relevant to all of the audience. So things like attention and stress, how engaged we are in a task if we can reach the flow state. So, I really looked quite deep. There weren't any, it's research that's quite patchwork, so there weren't any protagonists that really leapt out. Like, there are lots of scientists have made really important contributions, but it's not like it was one person's journey or one group's journey. So for the introduction, I just thought the image of the locus coeruleus is itself quite beautiful. I think this idea that you have this tiny bundle of neurons that are just a few millimeters in depth and length, and yet they're controlling so much of what's going on in the cortex. So I try to just paint that just to kind of get people intrigued, like what is this tiny blue dot doing in your brain? And then we move, in the second paragraph, that's really the start of the billboard, and it's just telling people like why you should care. So it's hinting at what we're going to discuss, what the piece is going to discuss, is calling it this kind of master switch, which or a gearbox, and we'll talk about the importance of metaphors later. But it's telling people, why this is relevant to their lives, and so I'm appealing to common experiences like procrastination, frustration. And then even still in the billboard, I'm just kind of trying to show the contrast with what was known before and what's known now. So, essentially, like, we didn't really understand what role the locus coeruleus was playing, apart from the idea had been, as I explained later in the piece, was that it was only involved in like the fight or flight response, but is now becoming much more nuanced, this understanding. So that's the billboard. That's just telling people, without giving away all of the information, it's just basically saying like, this is what you're here for. And it ends by telling people they will get some kind of news you can use, so it's going to be practically relevant to them as well. And then we go back to this backstory, and that's just, it's telling the history, it's giving the context that will be important for people to understand why the new developments are so important. I've found a few like nice facts, like it was discovered by Marie Antoinette's physician. There's little turning points here in the story that seem to be worth mentioning. So when we're talking about that progression of events, there seemed to be one turning point in the 1940s when Japanese researchers realized it was going to be important for, that the locus coeruleus was important for the maintaining consciousness in the brain. But then, I've kind of cut some paragraphs out, but like this is really where we start showing how the narrative is moving on by explaining how new developments in brain imaging and microscopy are actually helping to revolutionize what we thought we knew about this brain area. And then, so I say that this research has reached a critical mass, and that was because there are now multiple review papers that are calling for a greater appreciation of it. So you're just, in those paragraphs, I'm just trying to show like this is the progression of the ideas, and that, feels quite satisfying for a reader to see how what seemed quite nebulous is now kind of crystallized, and that they can see that there is a progression that's worth following. And then, like the rest of the piece goes into more of those details. It provides that payoff by telling readers how they can apply the knowledge of the locus coeruleus to their own lives. But I felt like this was just one, it's just one way that I tried to create a narrative shape to what I was writing, even though I couldn't find any particularly inspiring personal stories within that research. So when we're making these decisions and telling these stories, you might wonder, what level of detail should we go in? What level of scientific detail do we need? Like, what's the right balance of like statistics and the scientific research, and when should we use kind of colourful, illustrative examples or metaphors. And I just don't think there's any hard or fast rules, but I think the best writing is always going to contain a mixture of both. And that's kind of best thought of in terms of what's known as the ladder of abstraction. So you go from like very specific examples or ideas that are very concrete, rooted in like the familiar world. And then you can move up and down this ladder. And when you go up, you're going to more abstract, universal themes. It might be more about the commonalities over large groups of people, or it could be a kind of the progression of a lofty scientific idea that you want to present. But the best writing is always going to be moving up and down that ladder and trying to use, each piece of information you give is going to have a purpose in trying to like navigate that ladder really. So if you've just presented something that's very abstract, it can really help if you give a metaphor that's very concrete, which is why in the discussion of the locus coeruleus, I was really pleased when I saw that scientists were talking about it as the brain's gearbox, because suddenly you've gone from something that talking about the inner workings of the brain to something that is very relatable for people to understand why that might be significant. It's easy to imagine kind of what's going on there. Now, when you're looking at illustrations in particular, you need to ask, is it relatable to the reader? Can the illustration show something that is invisible in the research? So I'm thinking especially about case studies here, where you're talking about a specific, person who's can demonstrate a psychological phenomenon or maybe a historical anecdote, but you're asking like, what can they show you that isn't evident in the research? What interesting questions did they raise? And finally, you might choose not to use these illustrative examples because they might oversimplify the concepts. And you have to make that decision, like, are you willing with a metaphor or with a personal experience to risk that oversimplification? So as an kind of illustration of this, is a piece that I wrote for the Guardian about hyperphantasia, which is it's the opposite of aphantasia essentially. So some people really don't have any mental imagery, other people have such amazingly vivid imagery that it feels identical to what they're seeing with their own eyes or hearing with their own ears. So if we look at that ladder of abstraction, it starts, I guess, quite low with this example of William Blake. I chose him because he's obviously a figure that's very familiar to all of us. He has those connotations of, genius, someone whose mind we might not feel that we can understand. And then the idea is that this research is helping us to understand like what was behind his visions. But then I also talk about a more everyday example. So I guess that's bringing it even further down to the more concrete, where we have this guy, Mats Holm, who I interviewed, who describes just his incredible ability to visualize the city where he lives. We've got the billboard there where we're talking about why it's a neglected form of neurodiversity. We've got the backstory where we talk about Francis Galton's involvement in this research, and actually that is where the article starts to move a bit further up that ladder of abstraction, because then we're talking specifically about the scientific methods that have helped us to look at this empirically, so that we're not just relying on anecdote. And I think both are important there and I think readers really appreciate moving higher up on that ladder of abstraction, because it does show to them that what you're talking about is a kind of general experience, that you're not just talking about one person's subjective viewpoint, but they really want to know that it has been verified scientifically, and to understand those statistics, how common is it, what's going on in the brain, all of those things. But throughout the piece I'm kind of moving backwards and forwards, so we'll have like a paragraph that does look specifically on the statistics of the nature of what people are seeing. You know, the fact that some people say that they can actually see, if they imagine an apple, they can see it in front of them on their hand, you know, as if it were physically there. And we know that 75% of people can do that. And then I talked to some of the actual participants with hyperphantasia who can describe, you know, how that's affecting their life. So moving back down the ladder of abstraction to talk about, you know, how when they're listening to an audiobook, it's like watching a film. And you know, those are the kinds of questions that people, I think, would naturally be asking the readers. And you're just trying to parcel out the information in a way that you're covering all levels of the ladder of abstraction. Sometimes people write about their personal experiences. You know, I think that would be especially relevant for all of you if you're writing about your own experiences with, you know, in the workplace or with clients or with your research. This was the piece about a psychologist's guide to healing from racial trauma. And so this introduction, I think, is, you know, quite low down on the ladder of abstraction. And I think it's really crucial that the writer included that, because it helps people to realise the immediate personal effects of racial discrimination and the trauma that involves. And then she does go on to talk, you know, more specifically about the research and the statistics, but I think it needs to be grounded in personal experience. And that's why I'm talking about kind of what do these illustrations reveal that's invisible in the research. I think, you know, that's not something that would have come out of a research paper necessarily, but it is something that's very important for the reader to understand still. This piece was published in The Conversation, and I really loved this introduction. So the piece as a whole is about showing that actually athletes do have cognitive skills that had been under-recognised previously. But it starts with this historical anecdote about Babe Ruth. And what I liked about this was that it set the whole story up with a very concrete example, but at the centre of this story of Babe Ruth, there was this kind of big enigma. So he wasn't the physically fittest person around playing baseball at that time. And yet he was by far the best player. So the big question that people puzzled over, you know, when he was playing in the 1920s, was, you know, what was so special about him? And then the research by the author of the piece in The Conversation, Alberto Figueres, that his research has helped to answer that question. So even though, you know, we don't have that nice inciting incident in that, you know, Babe Ruth is not involved in the current research, I think it still serves that narrative function that helps to draw the reader into this story. So I think I'll pretty much end what I'm saying there. This is just a recap of what we've talked about. So it's defining your message, deciding how you want to talk about it. You know, what's your purpose? Is it an explainer, argument, or narrative? You know, what narrative elements can you use? You know, how should you structure that? And then talking about the ladder of abstraction. And if you do want to see further resources, you know, I do recommend those two websites. So Neiman Storyboard and the Open Notebook, both of which you know, have regular articles discussing the kind of craft of writing, non-fiction writing. But yeah, I'm ready for questions.
Great,
yeah.
Thanks. We've got some that have been submitted ahead of time, so while you think of your questions, I'll ask some of these. But yeah, we'll open up the discussion too, so feel free to comment on what you've heard before or ask any specific questions you have. So let's see what we've got. I think you've kind of touched on this initially, but one of the first questions is, how do you make complex topics easily understandable? As part of that's probably knowing your audience, but like, how do you go from taking some of your scientific research articles that you're reading to making it really approachable?
Yeah, I mean, definitely is knowing your audience. So I think, you know, it's kind of gauging like what is going to be new and exciting for the people that you want to talk to. And so if you're writing for like science or nature, that is going to be a bit different from if you're writing for like The Guardian. But even then, if you look at like Science and Nature's articles, they still are often like very narrative. And I think there's a reason for that. And it's like, no matter what your technical level of understanding, it still really helps to have narrative elements that help to, first of all, to organise your thinking, but also just to draw us through the research. That it's just a very natural way of communicating, and it's more appealing than just kind of presenting facts in like a kind of list-like fashion.
Yeah. And how do you go about figuring out what publication you want to submit to or where you want to send something? Do you have a publication in mind first, saying, I'm writing this and I want it to go to this particular news outlet or this particular magazine? Or do you write something and then go, oh, this is perfect for so-and-so?
Yeah, so I mean, normally I just keep a huge Google Doc of like any papers that have caught my attention. And so, then once I feel like a certain topic has kind of amassed enough research and I can already start to see some of those turning points that I spoke about, that's when I would start to think, like, here's a story I want to tell, and then I would start thinking, like, well, who is most likely to want to receive that, and most likely to publish it. So there are definitely things I would write for New Scientist that I don't think would work for The Guardian. Like, I think the piece on the locus ceruleus would have been, I think it could have worked for The Guardian, but I think it's a harder sell in some ways because it is a bit more about the kind of nitty-gritty of neuroscience and getting to understand specifically what's going on in the brain in a way that Guardian readers probably do want something a little bit lighter, a little bit more kind of practical or grounded in their everyday lives. So I'm considering all of those kinds of factors, but actually, often I might get a pitch rejected by one outlet and then I'll refine it for another outlet. And, they can be quite interchangeable. So it's often not as important as I would have thought. It's more about the framing and what you draw out for each outlet.
Yeah, that makes sense. I like this question. So how do you get people to hold still and spend some time to understand complex topics? I think you've sort of touched on that with the narrative, but with all the distractions, all of like someone's reading an article on their phone while notifications are coming up over those 10 minutes, like how do you keep people engaged to the end?
Yeah, I mean, it's the big challenge. And so when I was at the BBC, we had analytics software that would tell us at what point in a story like 50% of the readers were leaving it. So it was good feedback actually, because it really did let you see, what kind of techniques of storytelling work and what don't. And narrative did come out to be the best. So you would definitely see that even if you had like a 4,000 word piece, but it was told narratively with those kind of scenes, that dialogue, those protagonists, that people would be quite happy to, devote 10 minutes to reading that, more so than if you wrote, a kind of listicle, those articles that are just like a series of questions, which I think are fine as well, but people really did love having a story that they could find engrossing. So I do think that is one of the best things we can do. But I just think the main thing is just really bearing in mind, like, the very fact that there are so many distractions, and then making sure that your message is as relevant and important as it possibly can be. So if you feel it's important, making sure that you articulate that in a way that the reader's going to understand very early on, so that they are willing to invest that time.
Yeah, and you can probably get a sense of how much time on average different readers of different publications would invest in reading something too, right? Because there's some that are going to be like very short listicle style articles, and some publications where readers are really invested in that information, right? So
yeah, exactly. And also, I mean, what we really noticed was it also depends on the source of the traffic. So readers coming to the BBC from Reddit were on average staying on each story for 10 or 20 seconds.
Okay.
So they, I mean, but we weren't writing specifically for Reddit audiences.
Yeah.
But yeah, whereas people coming through the BBC homepage, I think, were less distractible. I guess because they had come specifically looking for the kind of content that we were producing. But yeah, like, I don't want to diss like those kind of outlets that do those like list features, because I actually think there's a real skill in splitting up information into bite-sized chunks that can be memorable and useful. So, but yeah, you're probably going to have less engagement, but then the pieces might be shorter, and you just have to make sure that each word really counts with that, and that you're presenting exactly what people need to know.
Yeah. What about, how can I explain connections between ideas that don't seem to be connected without trivializing or sensationalizing or being tedious? So it's a whole bunch in that question, but.
Yeah, I mean, I think, again, that's the advantage of writing in this narrative way, is that it does help you to build those bridges between the different ideas that you want to present. Because, I guess when you're writing it, you're always questioning yourself, like, how is this moving on the story? How is it building on the narrative that came before? I went to see a talk by George Saunders, the novelist and Booker Prize winner, and he said even with short stories, like the aim is always just to, if you ever have like a question, like if you're ever not sure like whether to include something or not, you just have to ask, like, is it building on and taking the story in a new direction compared to what you had said previously? Because I think sometimes as writers this story can just kind of sag and get quite. It's like you're not necessarily repeating the same point, but you're not actually moving it on either. So I think that's what, whenever you're trying to work out how to connect things, it has to be, well, how is this drawing a contrast to what I've just said, and how is it somehow answering a question or creating a new tension in the story that I can resolve later on? Yeah,
Makes sense. What about any questions that any of you might have? Yeah.
So you alluded to the different styles of narrative and the list type thing, but I'm just curious, is there a difference in style that works with online publications versus paper? So I'm thinking about Forbes magazine versus Forbes.com.
Yeah. I mean, I think with Forbes, there is a very clear difference between what you get on Forbes.com compared to the magazine, actually. And I think that's partly because a lot of those online articles are, I guess, more like blogs rather than, I think Forbes magazine would have more kind of in-depth reporting. That, I think that's very specific to the outlet. Other outlets do the same, like Scientific American had its blogging network too. And I guess I see those more as like a kind of, they're creating a kind of community of writers there who are contributing their own thoughts on events, and I think they are edited, but they're not like heavily edited, and it's not the same kind of pitching process that you would have had for the paper magazines or even on the websites. Those articles that are really kind of top priority on the homepage are probably more likely to be the ones that were commissioned by an editor specifically, because they follow some kind of narrative form, or that they have some kind of bigger story to tell. So I think, there's definitely different requirements. But in terms of like, do online audiences have different, if we're talking very generally, do online audiences have different requirements from kind of paper audiences? I don't think they do, actually. If you look at most outlets now, I think the digital subscribers are outnumbering the paper subscribers, but they're still looking for the same quality of writing, the same style of writing that they had before. So you see that on the New Yorker, for example. New Scientist, definitely, like, they're building a very strong online following, but actually people are still looking for the same kinds of well-reported, detailed, engaging and enlightening pieces that they already had. I guess, and I think actually, we saw with BuzzFeed and that kind of website where there was this trend to do those kind of very quick listicles and, content, very different style of content. And what is interesting to me is that they have now fallen by the wayside, essentially. So it was a fashion that hasn't necessarily lasted, and that people do seem to be going back to wanting the storytelling rather than just bite-sized facts.
I guess one of the things that was on my mind is simple word count, which is that on Forbes.com you probably are limited to 1,000 words.
Yeah.
whereas in a paper, you'll get 2,000, for example. So are there any tips for, do you need to do anything different when you're really tight on word count?
Yeah, it's interesting because I think sometimes online it can go the other way, where because there's no actual paper, like you're not restricted to the size of 2 pages or 4 pages, that some online pieces can get quite kind of baggy and bloated.
Forms do give you a word count.
Oh, right, interesting. Yeah. And I think they'll have worked that out for their audience. Even I think it is quite interesting that I think, so say for scientific articles, I think people tend to prefer about 2,000 words, and you can see that in magazines, in print or online, that like you can look up those metrics that I mentioned, like the optimum engagement, and that seems to be something that is just long enough to feel satisfying, not too long that it's too laborious to read. So yeah, but it absolutely depends, and I think it also just depends on the story you're trying to tell. If it's a very complicated, intricate story and it has a lot of narrative drama, then that does warrant maybe 4,000 or 5,000 words, even online. But a lot of stories can be condensed to 2,000 words, 1,000 words, and they can be very satisfying just as they are.
Good, thank you.
I suppose I had a question about the kind of pitching process, which you kind of asked, but I'm just curious about this Google Doc that you mentioned, just in terms of finding those ideas. Is it just that, do you just read lots of research papers? Are there like specific journals that you kind of favour, that it's kind of your patch of science? Or I was also thinking, when someone has like a new book to promote, maybe that's too late. Like, as in, I think I read it in one of the examples that you posted, if someone's got a book to promote, can be quite good to maybe think about new books coming out to try and pitch an article in terms of, I've asked, I don't know, have I asked a question?
No, you have. I do read a lot of journals, or at least, I go through the table of contents. Often the titles alone will tell me something might be potentially of interest, I'll read the abstracts, and then it's, often I just will feel like I need to park it because maybe it feels too small, the story of that particular paper. But I kind of just leave it, and then, maybe a few months later, a year later, I'll find another piece of research that complements that, and it makes me realise that there is this kind of broader trend that we're talking about, and also that hopefully when I read the papers themselves, you can start to identify what those big questions are going to be that the piece could answer. They often just reading the kind of introduction of a paper can also tell you a little bit about the turning points or the drama that has been involved in this research. So that's primarily how I find my stories. And sometimes, it can just be, I think review papers have been really good for me, because then it's a kind of sign actually that the research has reached this kind of climax, that now it's worth summing it up, and the writers of the review paper have they want to present this new argument that hadn't been seen previously, and then that tells me that there probably is a more interesting story, behind it that I can tell. When regarding books, so with the Locus Ceruleus piece, the kind of blue dot, so actually I'd read, it was a book by Mithu Storoni, and I read the book and it was great, and so I was working just temporarily doing a bit of cover for New Scientist, and I was a bit tempted to pitch just like a kind of extract from the book could have worked fine. But it did seem like there was, like when I spoke to the author, she told me there was a lot of this research she hadn't been able to include in the book, but like really explained the science behind what she was presenting. And then I looked into that research, and based on what she was telling me, and I thought, well, that is a very interesting story that can kind of complement her book and help. But yeah, that was the story behind that one. There's nothing wrong with pitching stories around books. Like I do that all the time often with Q&As with the authors. But I guess I still want the kind of my staple diet of the stuff that I write to be ideas that I found purely myself, rather, but that is more egoism than anything else. Like it's satisfying when you feel you're presenting something that maybe hasn't been brought to the public before in any other form. So yeah.
The other thing that I think is interesting to understand is what is that process? Like if you're a psychologist with some research you think is interesting, what goes on behind the scenes of a magazine or publication trying to find stories, or if you're trying to pitch stories, like how do you go through that, navigate that process from taking your idea to a magazine to getting it published? Like what do freelance writers do? What are staff writers? What are, editors? Like how do you navigate that process?
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of can be quite difficult to know, especially when you're getting started, but even, whenever I try to approach a new outlet, like, sometimes some websites like the Atlantic's website do have like good pitching guidelines, so they give you a bit of information about who to send it to. They are quite good actually at, they've got this kind of open email account that is checked regularly, so it's not just like you're going on the slush pile but never being read. Like they do get back to you, which is lovely. But yeah, I think like really trying to research the publication in a bit of detail, looking at social media like LinkedIn or Twitter to try to identify who the editors are. You really want to make sure that you're pitching to the right editor. So firstly, someone who's dealing with the particular part of the magazine that you want to publish in. So is it news, is it features, is it opinion? You should have a clear idea of the story you want to tell and how it would fit within those different molds. And then when you present your pitch, like I always try to give a headline that would be suitable for the publication that captures that key message I want to present, along with a strapline that would just provide a little bit more information. And then I'd give about 200 or 300 words that presents a kind of potted version of the story, and that's often written in a narrative style. So I would want to say, what that inciting incident is, summarise what the developments have been, talk about what the kind of broader consequences are. And I hear a lot from editors that they tell me that the biggest mistake that writers make is that they pitch topics, not stories. And so that's why I think it's important to know early on what that kind of narrative development would be within your piece. Or if you're doing those other kinds, like the explainer or the argument pieces, at least explaining, what is the specific argument that you're trying to convince readers and why is that important? Or with the explainer, why is this relevant to readers now? Like, why did they need to know what you're trying to explain to them? Like, what is the concept? And more importantly, how is it relevant? But, you do see, and when I was an editor, like I would receive these pitches and the worst would just be people might have just read something on Wikipedia and they would send me a link to the Wikipedia page. Like, well, if it's on Wikipedia, I don't really think I want to commission an article on that actually, because you want to be presenting something new and original. But yeah, it would just be like, I've seen a bunch of research, but it's like, I can't see how you're going to organise that research into something that's going to be a compelling, informative and entertaining read for the audience.
Kind of relating to explainers. If you've got something that you're trying to put out, it's probably easier to a concrete example. Really interested in finance, because I used to be in finance, and everybody thinks finance is all about the money, but actually it's not, it's about people. And there's all the stuff from positive psychology about, what your values are, and money's a means to do stuff. It's not valuable in itself, yada yada yada. Got all those. So what tends to happen is I'm writing what amount to explainer articles, saying to people, look, here's loads of established techniques that you've got from positive psychology, CBT techniques, all this sort of stuff, that actually is far more important than knowing about investment, because the investment is dead easy, but the bit in between your ears is the really complicated bit. So actually psychology tells you all about it. And I used to go to conferences and all the psychologists would come up to me, you used to be in finance, didn't you? Should I have an ISA or whatever? And I'm going, irrelevant. What do you want the money to do? Is it better to, if I can try and write it, which I'm not very good at, but I can write an exciting explainer, or would it be better to try, because obviously you've talked a lot about making it narrative. Do you think with that sort of thing, a narrative, if I can hit on the right, like you said, going up the ladder of abstraction, personalising it, whatever, that's going to work better? Because it's getting people to hold still long enough, rather than, oh, I thought this would be about money, it's about me. I don't want to read it. It's getting them to think, oh, hang on, actually. Because I'm not good at writing it like that, to get people to dig in and start thinking, oh, actually, I ought to try some of this stuff.
Yeah, I mean, I think, so what I didn't say, but is definitely true, is that sometimes you can incorporate, you can blur the lines a bit between these genre of articles. So I actually think, you could incorporate narrative into and explain it in that case. And it could be that you have a really good example of someone who, transformed their relationship with money through some of the techniques that you mentioned. And then it doesn't have to be that person applied everything, but I think that can give you a bit of a narrative opening to the piece that will, it engages, people's attention, but it also makes it feel very relevant to them, because if you've seen someone else, it is like moving that ladder of abstraction down towards the concrete. If you've seen the effect it could have on someone else, it makes you realise the effect that it could have on you too. So that's the kind of thinking that I would include. And even if you did like a listicle, it can be quite nice actually, even within that, to have like these narrative examples within each one to kind of reinforce that message. But
that's really helpful. Thank you.
Great. The other thing we could talk about is social media and communication on social media, because that's constantly a difficult topic, I think. But it's also related to all of the other platforms, because like you mentioned, BuzzFeed dying, I think that's when all of the social media sites killed all the external links. So all of a sudden, all of these sites that were completely dependent on traffic from these specific sources, and then Facebook and Twitter said, no, we don't want to link to anyone else's websites anymore. Those platforms are gone. So how do you figure out how much time is worth investing in social media account, sharing your information on social media, or putting even information into those platforms exclusively?
so I'm definitely not the best person to talk to here. So I've got friends who have been amazing with social media, and they've built up a platform very quickly. But I guess it's kind of like playing to your strengths as well. I don't love presenting to my phone for Instagram or TikTok. It's just not something that I feel very comfortable doing. So even though I'm happy to do it occasionally for book promotion, or if I'm asked to do it, but it's something that I find quite time consuming and difficult, and I just much prefer sitting down to write and to kind of crafting a story that way. So I think it does depend on personal taste a lot, and I think especially if you're, I was going to say if you're of the generation that has grown up with social media just as part of your life from when you were, at primary school, then maybe it's easier. But actually, lots of people across the generations have been really successful at doing this. So I don't think age is a barrier, but I just think it is just a kind of personal preference. But I think it can be a really nice kind of doorway into other ways of presenting and communicating. So one of my friends is Sophia Smith-Gaylor, who used to be the social media manager at the BBC, at BBC Future, where I used to work. And she's just done this really great job of kind of bridging her social media presence. She's huge on TikTok and Instagram with her writing. She's written a book. She's currently writing a second book. She specialises in kind of language and the kind of psychology of language and kind of sexual ethics, and she just manages to kind of hold this all together in a way that I don't think I could do myself actually. But yeah, it can be a really good opportunity, and it's just if you enjoy it, then I think it's worth doing. But if you don't, then pick another way to express yourself. Because because sometimes I'm told by people, they're like, oh, why don't you try to build a platform? And it's true, I could have, it's great to have hundreds of thousands of followers on Twitter, but also it doesn't always mean that then it doesn't mean when you publish an article, for example, that people will read it, or when you publish a book that people will buy it, because the engagement is very different. So if I was trying to build social media just to publicise my journalism, as a means to an end, I don't think it would be that successful actually, because they're just, the translation isn't always obvious.
Yeah. Yeah, well, it's good to hear that you can do it from either direction, right? So you don't necessarily absolutely need a massive social media following to be successful in publishing or in journalism or in any of the traditional media sources, but then so you can go at it from either angle, which is good.
Yeah, because sometimes publishers, you'll read on Twitter people complaining that a publisher had said, well, you don't have a big enough platform for us to want to publish your book, and that's often misread as meaning your social media platform isn't big enough. But actually, if you're writing in the traditional media, that is also a platform that they care about. So they do, especially book publishers probably do want to know that you do have contacts and means of promoting your work. And it's a shame that they can't always provide that for you, but it's definitely an advantage if you can. But it doesn't have to depend on the number of followers you have on Instagram. It can come from any kind of way that you're reaching an audience. So it could be a Substack, it could just be writing a column for a newspaper, appearing on podcasts, whatever.
Yeah, and it's more difficult to get into complex issues on social media, right? Like if you've got your different formats, if you've got your 2,000 word article, 1,000 word article, or you've got a 40 word kind of description of it, there's certain nuance you can't get into and don't want to get into on Twitter probably, right?
Right, yeah, I mean that's partly why I've never loved Twitter, and I like it even less now. But even, I think things like TikTok and Instagram actually, where you can do kind of longer videos, you can get nuance in there. But again, it's just you can't tell a really long narrative story that way, whereas maybe you could on a podcast or a YouTube video. So.
And sometimes people go into those different platforms or different channels with different intentions.
Yeah.
So there's definitely more people looking for an argument on certain social media platforms than there are reading a long read in other publications. So
yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Then you've written quite a few books, and I can see some of this would apply to books certainly, but what else would you say in terms of writing books that's not what we've talked about here?
Yeah, so I do think actually the structures and techniques that I spoke about there are very relevant for books. But I would also say it's when you're writing over, you're writing at length, often you would kind of split your story that you're telling into a series of smaller stories in the same way that a novel is a series of smaller scenes. And so that's what, say for each chapter, I would try to have maybe 3 kind of mini stories within that together kind of a hierarchy that build together and have their own narrative arc, but you're kind of composing it of smaller building blocks. And then, again, then the chapters have, when they fit together, they have their own arc that helps you to, by the end, that the reader's going to feel that they've been on this journey and suddenly they've had that epiphany.
And then overall,
there's a bigger journey too. Yeah, exactly. Which I think is very similar actually to fiction like novels or films. Yeah.
Question? Yeah.
Just picking up on something you mentioned earlier about playing to your strengths or graphic designers, I was just curious about your view, actually, my personal view about how much of this ability to communicate well, like scientific information, for example, is kind of a natural flair, and how much of it is sort of being quite disciplined and following structures and techniques, or maybe it's a combination.
Yeah. No, I mean, I think it is a combination, definitely. Yeah. So, I studied maths at university, actually, but I had always been interested in writing, like I was still, even while I was doing my degree, I was writing kind of fiction, like short stories. I was still reading widely, so it was always an interest and a passion for me. And then actually this was, my career was a way of kind of combining those two passions. But I do think it was definitely a steep learning curve. And, you know, when I started out, like I look back at those early pieces and I don't think they were great, but I think it's, you know, it's about learning from your mistakes, learning from other writers, learning from the feedback that you get from editors, looking for new ways that you can engage readers, asking yourself why you were engaged by a particular story and trying to, you know, replicate that in your own writing. I think all of that is really important. Yeah, and actually, you know, as an editor, I would say when I've worked with writers, what's quite interesting is it's the worst writers often who are the most difficult to work with as well. And I feel it's maybe because their ego has got in the way of that learning process, whereas there are some writers who just seem to adapt very quickly to what you're asking, and I think that is because they've remained open-minded. And they're going through that process of constantly looking for how they can improve. So yeah, I think with writing, like you get a lot of knockbacks, you get a lot of criticism, and we do have to try to kind of put our egos to one side and to learn from that if we want to get better.
Yeah.
So I was just thinking about the creative process in today's day. Past 2 to 3 years, that artificial intelligence has taken over a lot of it. I have observed, both in terms of art and illustration and so on as well. So I was wondering how you have either adapted to or stayed away from, or how you feel that artificial intelligence is going to impact or has already started to impact your work process or your field and the career progression for people maybe similar to you in the next 10 years?
Yeah, it's difficult to predict like what is going to happen in the future. And I've played around with AI, but I would never use it to try to write an article for me. You know, I do think that raises the same issues as plagiarism. I think there's real dangers in becoming dependent on that, and it's also, you know, what satisfaction are you getting from prompting an AI to do it? But it does worry me that eventually it might reach a point where, yeah, there'll be a need for fewer human writers. But I think that's the advantage of this kind of technique. You know, the kind of tools that I'm talking about here are something that I think at the moment AI would really struggle with doing that. You know, it can summarize information very easily, but actually creating that coherent narrative arc, I think, is much more of a challenge for it to do, especially if you care about the accuracy of the arc and the fact you want it to involve all of the nuances that's actually evident in the research. So yeah, I sometimes do use ChatGPT almost as a search engine. And then obviously I verify what I find through it. But you know, I think it can sometimes be good at telling you avenues of research to pursue, but I don't rely on it any more than that. It's, you know, no more than Google, really.
Yeah, the other I can comment on that too, because I've used it a bit, and I found it's actually better for like debugging computer code than it is for language. I don't know if that's why that's, you know, the data it's been fed on, or because that's like a verifiable answer that you can check. You're like, yep, that absolutely gave me the exact answer that I was looking for or I want. But I think the problem with like language is it kind of tends towards the average, and I think that's how the systems work. So the challenge is it's going to be better than, say, like an undergraduate writing a dissertation who's struggling. It's kind of at that middle point level. It's nowhere near someone who's a good writer or a good researcher or someone who learns quickly from human feedback. But at a low level, it can do those kind of basic tasks that you know, you just need something that's kind of generic text, or if you can think through the process and ask it questions about where the information is coming from and check it all, it can be kind of useful for that. I personally don't worry about it replacing good writers, but I think there's a lot of kind of content writing and stuff it will replace, because it's pretty generic text anyway.
Yeah, I totally agree with that.
Yeah, you, and then you next.
Yeah, I wondered if you had kind of any advice for when you're presenting, say, results to an audience who you know have sort of like varying levels of understanding, for example, with statistics or results, and how I guess you like any advice for striking the right balance between not boring people that already probably know the basics versus making sure that everyone is understanding the content before kind of presenting those results.
Yeah, I mean, it's, that's the hardest task, I think, when an audience, is composed of lots of different people. And, obviously that is true, like when you're writing for any kind of broad audience, any popular kind of publication, is that you will have, the real experts reading it, as well as the people who know nothing about psychology at all. So I do kind of tend to think that we should be serving appealing to the lowest common denominator in that way. And what I mean is that, if you think there's a chance that if quite a few people within your audience are not going to understand the methods that you're talking about or the jargon, then I think it is important for accessibility that you do help to explain that. Or the other alternative is just to kind of leave out some of that information that you think will lead you to get too bogged down, essentially. So sometimes it is just easier to omit details than to add them if you think that the work the reader's going to have to put in to understand it is not going to have a suitable payoff. But I think also even the more expert readers are probably going to be more forgiving of you for serving the people who have less expertise than the people with less expertise would be if you were to write it at such a high level that they just can't understand it at all. Especially if you're, if it's writing and people can skim what they already know, then it's not going to be too much of a problem for them.
I've got two questions. They're going in. In your sort of development journey, in your writing, have you used mentors or have the editors been your mentors in terms of reviewing your work? That's my first question. The second question is, I've just completed my master's and I've done some research which is not publishable, but I'd like to tell people about it in a caveated way. Are there any tips that you can give me about that?
Yeah. So mentors, I mean, I guess, my immediate colleagues have been my mentors, really. So especially, Celeste Beaver, who now works at Nature, Richard Fisher, who worked with me at New Scientist and then was my boss at the BBC. They've been very encouraging. Also people that I've met, purely online have been really good. John Sutton from The Psychologist, has always been very encouraging and helpful and supportive. I'm very much grateful to those people. And also it can be helpful to kind of get feedback from, people within your life. So like my partner often, reads what I've written and provides feedback too. It's very much a collaborative process. Especially with books, like my agent, my editor, it's like there's the copy editor, there's so many people who are involved actually that it's it's not like a kind of, you're not the only person on that journey, you're surrounded by other people. In terms of presenting your research in a caveated way, so I do think the real benefit of writing in a narrative way is that actually those caveats can be very much a part of the journey that you're presenting, of that narrative development that you're presenting, especially if you have managed to address some of those caveats. But the nuances, or if there are conflicting results from other groups, for example, they can all be part of this kind of dialogue that you're presenting and this trajectory that you're presenting. So it's, I feel like some writers complain that they feel like they're pushed into just writing, they'll actually say, it's like, they'll moan that, the editor wanted a very straight narrative. But actually, I think it's all about the way that you weave those into the narrative that can allow for a lot of nuance. And actually, editors are mostly pretty happy for that if you do it as part of the storytelling. So it's definitely, there's a lot of room for nuance, is what I'm saying.
Thank you.
And I think, just quickly, I'll reinforce too that there's a lot of BPS publications that have editors that want to publish you and will be quite supportive. So they'll be critical potentially, but like John Sutton at The Psychologist is a good example,
amazing,
who's a great editor, and he'll walk you through the process and multiple drafts and stuff and saying, this is what we're looking for, this is what we need for our readers. The Division of Occupational Psychology has a new publication, Occupational Psychology Outlook, edited by Priyasanthi, who's great as well, and who's another editor who, if you've got work that you want to publish, like she's an editor who will help get you through that process. So it's not going to be the same, necessarily exactly the same as pitching to a media outlet. So definitely take advantage of any and all of the BPS publications and speaking to the editors about that if that's something you're interested in or want some kind of mentoring help, advice on publishing. So I will recommend that. Yeah, you had a question.
Well, I wondered if there were particular mistakes people like me make as an academic researcher for decades, where I've written lots of academic articles in all very traditional academic way for psychology journals. But I think then if someone like me were making a transition to writing for, say, some of those kind of online formats or whatever, are there kind of certain holes that we always fall down, or things we should really watch out for? I mean, I really get the narrative, in a sense of that being so important, but I wonder if there are particular things that we quite often get wrong.
I mean, in general, I think that so I've worked with, as a commissioning editor, I've worked with scientists from lots of different fields, and I would have to say psychologists, I think, do a really good job normally of writing about their research, because I think it is maybe part of the discipline is it makes you're maybe just a bit more conscious and aware of how it's relating to people's lives. So I'm sure, I'm not sure that psychologists do tend to fall into a lot of the traps, but if I do think more generally about kind of what would make my heart sink when I'm reading a piece. I think the number one thing is just that the writer hasn't really clarified beforehand what message they want to say, and that just is it's like puts the whole article on really crumbly foundations then, and the whole structure is wobbly and messy essentially because of that, because they don't know. It's you need to know what that message is to know what the end point is of this journey, otherwise it's just wandering all over the place, and that's the kind of article that is going to need a lot more editing, because the editor's having to do that kind of heavy lifting to try to find what the purpose of the piece was. And yeah, I'd really say it's the writer's responsibility to be doing that from the moment they pitch, and then absolutely when they're writing, to be holding that in mind with every sentence that they write. It has to be moving you towards that ultimate goal.
The other thing I'd say is don't get too discouraged if you're if you're pitching things or wanting to try and submit stuff to publications, because probably the majority of responses, maybe that's just my experience, are going to be you don't hear anything back. Sometimes you'll hear a no, and then very occasionally you'll get a yes. But most editors, I can't imagine how many pitches most people get every day or every week. But it's it takes a bit of tenacity sometimes.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, there's a lot of kind of rejection and criticism. Like Zadie Smith said, she thinks to be a writer is just to consign yourself to a lifetime of sadness. But I think, it is, you do have to have quite a thick skin, or at least just recognise that the criticism, isn't personal, and that the editors have the same goals in mind that you do, really.
Yeah.
Another question. I mean, obviously, apart from your own books, but are there particular authors, science writers that you think, because I'm just sort of thinking popular science type stuff, because obviously Malcolm Gladwell sells really well. Mm-hmm. Yeah. I don't want you to say anything libelous or whatever, but I was just interested. I had recommended to me quite recently, I read a book called An Immense World which is
yeah.
about, I can't for the life of me remember who wrote it,
Yeah.
but I thought that was absolutely brilliant. When you were talking earlier on, I thought, oh, yeah, that's why it's so good. Because you keep getting little personal stories about people who've spent their life researching mollusks or something, and you get this thing comes out, and there's 5 or 6 little things, but they get to the end of the chapter, and then every so often the person will pop up again 5 chapters later on in a different context, and I was actually mesmerised by it.
Yeah, that's Ed Young, and he definitely writes in a narrative style. I mean, so does Malcolm Gladwell, for better or worse. I think, you know, some people think that it's that he's a bit too concerned about the shape of the story, but, you know, each to their own, I guess. But, yeah, like Will Storr, I think, is someone, so he's been a bit of a mentor to me, and I would definitely recommend reading Will Storr, so it's 2 R's, Storrr. And he, like all of his books are great, and they, you know, are mostly about psychology. But also he, you know, the most relevant book would be The Science of Storytelling. So that's really his big specialism now, is actually looking at the neuroscience of why we love stories and explaining kind of how we can use that to our advantage. So, you know, his book is really, you know, beautifully written. He uses so many brilliant examples from, you know, the whole of literature, but I think the lessons that he describes can be, you know, they are applicable to whatever we're writing.
Any other questions? I think we're getting towards the end of the session now, so I know it's late on a Friday night or Friday afternoon. All right, well, I think we'll leave it there then. Thanks very much, David.
Thanks, Jay, for organising the event.
Yeah, thanks everyone for coming.